Hi everyone, today I'm going to tell you the one true story. Please support me by liking and subscribing. Thanks, are you ready? Here we go. Elliot Morris wasn't the kind of guy you'd expect to wander into the darker corners of human experience. At 29, he worked a quiet IT job, spent weekends exploring bookstores, and occasionally dabbled in the awkward world of online dating. His latest match, Clara, had intrigued him. Her messages hinted at an adventurous streak he found both thrilling and unnerving. That night, Clara led him into the heart of the city, where the old brick buildings loomed like forgotten monuments. She brought him to a venue she described as a secret club, a place where people live freely. Elliot's nerves prickled as they descended a narrow staircase into a dimly lit basement. The room was filled with crimson light, casting shadows that writhed like living things. The air was thick with incense and an unsettling energy. Figures in dark, elaborate attire murmured in low voices. A symbol Elliot couldn't decipher was painted on the walls in red, stark and forbidding. "This is intense," Elliot said, forcing a laugh. Clara smiled, her eyes gleaming. "Just trust me." At first, the gathering seemed like a theatrical performance, a macabre play designed to shock and provoke. But as the night progressed, the atmosphere shifted. Rituals unfolded, each one darker than the last. Elliot wanted to leave, but his curiosity, and Clara's grip on his hand, kept him rooted. The leader, a gaunt figure in a hooded cloak, approached him. "New blood," he intoned. "You have potential." Elliot stammered a protest, but Clara whispered, "It's just for fun. Say yes." Against his better judgment, Elliot agreed, unaware of the chains he was forging for himself. The initiation began subtly, a challenge to confront his fears, to embrace the primal side of his nature. First, it was a game, but the deeper he went, the more his sense of self began to unravel. The rituals demanded acts that blurred the lines of morality, each step chipping away at his conscience. One night, he found himself alone in the club's darkened halls. He stumbled upon a chamber filled with bizarre implements and symbols. His reflection in a cracked mirror was unrecognizable. Wild eyes, a face pale with guilt and fear. He tried to leave the club, to return to his ordinary life, but the pull was too strong. Each time he walked away, he was drawn back by a mix of dread and compulsion. The club seemed to seep into his mind, his dreams, his very essence. Elliot's torment became unbearable. To atone for what he'd done, he began to harm himself, carving symbols into his skin in a desperate attempt to expunge his guilt. But the more he inflicted pain on himself, the more the club's rituals escalated. It was as if the entity at its heart fed on his anguish. The final straw came when he realized the true cost of his actions. One night, he stood before the club's leader, who presented him with an impossible choice: to inflict suffering on another or to endure unimaginable agony himself. Elliot chose the latter. His descent into madness was swift and unrelenting. The pain he endured became a ceaseless echo, even after death. Trapped in a purgatorial nightmare, he was forced to relive every moment of his torment, both as perpetrator and victim. And yet, within the torment, a spark of humanity remained. Elliot began to fight back, not against his punishment, but against the darkness that had claimed him. Each act of defiance, no matter how small, became a step toward reclaiming his soul. In the end, Elliot's story was not one of damnation, but of struggle, a harrowing journey through the abyss and back toward the light. Elliot awoke one night in his apartment, drenched in sweat. The dreams, no, the memories, had returned. Each one was more vivid than the last, playing out in grotesque detail. He saw the faces of those he had hurt, their eyes wide with terror. Their screams echoed in his mind, a symphony of guilt that refused to fade. He staggered to the bathroom, clutching the sink. His reflection stared back at him, pale and gaunt. The scars on his arms and chest seemed to burn in the dim light, as if they carried a life of their own. He had hoped that, by hurting himself, he could balance the scales, ease the weight of his sins. But it was never enough. The club had twisted his psyche, And now, even in solitude, he could not escape its grasp. It had been months since he last saw Clara. She had vanished without a trace, as if she had been a phantom all along. Elliot had tried to find her, to confront her, to make sense of what had happened. But every lead brought him back to dead ends or darker paths. He realized he was truly alone in this nightmare. He tried to seek help. Therapists, spiritual leaders, even law enforcement. None could understand the depth of his torment. How could he explain what he'd been through without sounding insane? The club's rituals, the horrors he'd witnessed and participated in, weren't just crimes. They were violations of the very fabric of his soul. One day, Elliot received a letter in the mail. It was a single black envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. "You cannot run from what you are. Join us again, or let the abyss consume you." Elliot's hands trembled as he read it. He burned the note in his sink, but the words had already carved themselves into his mind. That night, he dreamed of the club again. Its blood-red walls, the leader's hollow voice, and the endless labyrinth of corridors filled with cries and whispers. When he woke, he found the same symbol from the club's walls etched into his forearm, fresh and bleeding. He hadn't done it himself. At least, he didn't think so. Elliot's life became a blur of waking nightmares and hallucinations. He started to see the faces of his victims everywhere, in the strangers on the subway, in the shadows of his apartment, even in the mirror. He couldn't tell what was real anymore. The self-inflicted wounds grew deeper, more frequent. He carved symbols into his flesh, hoping to keep the darkness at bay. But the rituals seemed to follow him, invading his every thought. The pain he inflicted on himself was no longer just physical. It was spiritual, existential. He felt as though his very being was unraveling. One night, unable to bear the torment any longer, Elliot decided to end it. He stood on the edge of a bridge, the cold wind biting at his skin. As he looked down at the dark, churning water, he felt a strange calm wash over him. But just as he stepped forward, he heard a voice. "Elliot." He turned to see the club's leader standing behind him, cloaked and impassive. "You think you can escape this?" the leader said, his voice low and resonant. "Death is not the end. You are bound to us, body and soul. If you leap, you will only find yourself back where you started." Elliot sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. "Acceptance," the leader replied. "You cannot fight what you are. Embrace it, and you will find peace." But Elliot refused. In the days that followed, he resolved to resist the pull of the club, no matter the cost. He began to document everything he had experienced, filling notebooks with his memories, his fears, and his hopes for redemption. He hoped that, by confronting the darkness head-on, he could reclaim some part of himself. The more he wrote, the more he realized that the club wasn't just a physical place. It was a manifestation of his deepest fears and desires. The rituals had tapped into something primal within him, something he could not ignore but also refused to surrender to. He sought out others who had escaped similar horrors, forming a small group of survivors. Together, they shared their stories and supported one another in their fight against the lingering shadows of their pasts. In the end, Elliot's journey was not about erasing what he had done, but about finding the strength to move forward despite it. The scars on his body remained, but they became symbols of his resilience rather than his torment. Though the club still haunted his dreams, Elliot learned to face the darkness with courage. He understood that while the abyss would always be a part of him, it did not have to define him. For months, Elliot fought valiantly against the pull of the club. He threw himself into recovery, filling his days with rituals of normalcy. Work, therapy, journaling, and tentative reconnections with family. But the darkness lingered, a persistent shadow at the edge of his thoughts. The club didn't send more letters or summon him overtly. Instead, it worked subtly, whispering to him in the dead of night, sending flickering images through his mind. The weight of his guilt, compounded by his knowledge of what he had done, grew unbearable. He began to sleep less, eat less, and speak less. his notebooks filled with frantic scribbles, symbols, and phrases he didn't remember writing. One sentence appeared over and over: "You can't escape who you are." One cold winter evening, Elliot found himself standing outside the club's door again, his breath visible in the freezing air. He didn't remember how he had gotten there, but the familiar crimson glow seeped through the cracks of the door, beckoning him. This time, there was no Clara to lead him in, just the weight of inevitability pressing on his chest. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The interior had changed. The familiar chambers of eerie rituals were gone, replaced by a twisting maze of stone corridors. The walls pulsed as though alive, and the air was suffused with the stench of decay. He wandered aimlessly, the silence around him broken only by his own ragged breaths and the distant, faint sound of crying. Eventually, he reached a large, cavernous room where the club's leader waited. The gaunt figure smiled, but this time the expression seemed almost predatory. "Welcome back," the leader said. "We knew you would return." The torment began immediately. Elliot's first task was to reenact the rituals he had tried so desperately to forget. He was given no choice in the matter. The club's leader seemed to wield a supernatural influence over him, making resistance impossible. His hands moved against his will, his body a puppet to the club's dark purpose. But the worst came when Elliot realized that his victims were no longer human. They were something far worse, twisted, monstrous reflections of his own sins. Their faces shifted and contorted, bearing features he recognized. A girl he had tormented, a man he had betrayed, even his own face staring back at him with a grotesque grin. They didn't scream like humans. Their cries were an inhuman cacophony, a sound that pierced his soul and stripped away what little sanity he had left. One night, during a particularly harrowing ritual, Elliot saw something he hadn't before. A glimmer of hope. One of the victims reached out to him, whispering, "You don't have to do this." In that moment, something snapped inside him. He lunged at the club's leader, intent on destroying the source of his torment. But as he reached for the figure, the leader simply laughed. A deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the chamber. "Did you think this would free you?" the leader said, his voice growing deeper and more monstrous. With a single gesture, Elliot was thrown backward, his body slamming into the stone wall. His chest burned as though set ablaze, and he collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The leader stood over him, his hood falling away to reveal a face that was no face at all, just an abyss of shifting shadows and countless eyes, all staring into Elliot's soul. "You've been ours since the moment you stepped through that door," the leader said. "And now, you will serve us forever." Elliot felt his heart stop. Death claimed him not with a bang, but with a quiet, suffocating certainty. Elliot awoke, or thought he did, in a place that defied comprehension. The world around him was a churning void, filled with flickering images of every atrocity he had committed. The real monsters he had met in the club now surrounded him, their grotesque forms a reflection of his own guilt and fear. They laughed, jeered, and whispered in languages he couldn't understand, their voices filling the emptiness. Every sensation was amplified 1,000-fold. When they touched him, it felt like fire and ice slicing through his skin. When they spoke, their words echoed endlessly in his mind, each syllable tearing at his sense of self. But the worst part was the mirror. In the center of the void stood a massive, cracked mirror. It forced Elliot to relive every moment of his descent, every choice he had made, every soul he had harmed. He tried to look away, but the mirror seemed to follow him, its surface reflecting not just his actions, but his innermost thoughts and fears. As time lost meaning, Elliot began to understand the true nature of his punishment. The monsters didn't torment him for their own amusement. They were there to ensure he tormented himself. Every time he tried to escape the mirror, he found himself back at its base, clawing at the ground, screaming for release. Every wound he inflicted on himself in his desperation healed instantly, leaving him whole and broken all at once. The monsters whispered to him, their voices a mix of mockery and pity. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" one said. its many mouths curling into a smile. You're finally free to punish yourself forever. Elliot's torment continued for what felt like an eternity. The abyss offered no release, no redemption. Only the endless cycle of guilt, pain, and self-destruction. And yet, deep within him, a small flicker of defiance remained. If he couldn't escape, he resolved to face the darkness with what little strength he had left. Perhaps, in doing so, he could find some sliver of meaning in his suffering. But the abyss wasn't done with him yet. A living doll, cursed to watch the world unravel, forever trapped in the grip of the one who had given him everything, and taken everything in return. Thank you for watching. Please support me and meet me in another video.